About to hear, a young African president steps into a grand hall filled with European ministers, men who still believe Africa owes them everything. But instead of shouting back, this leader answers with something far more powerful than rage: silence. And in that silence, something extraordinary happens. The balance of history begins to shift. This is the story of how one man's quiet defiance disrupted centuries of entitlement and proved that the most devastating response doesn't always come from raised voices, but from the refusal to play along. The French minister smirked. "Africa still owes us," he said. The room erupted in laughter. Everyone joined in, except one man. Ibrahim Traoré didn't laugh. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just looked. That calm, unwavering stare, delivered in total silence, would leave a crack in France's diplomatic mask so deep it would never fully recover. Inside the chandelier-lit halls of the Grand Palais, sunlight fractured through crystal and danced across polished marble floors that had once hosted emperors, generals, and architects of colonial empire. But today this palace had been transformed into a stage. The International Economic Forum had drawn the world's most powerful players into one room to talk about Africa. Not with Africa, but about it. As if it were a commodity, a contract, a puzzle to be solved. A dozen heads of state sat at the crescent-shaped table. Flags fluttered quietly behind them. European commissioners flipped through spreadsheets. Economists whispered projections. Investors watched like hawks, their fingers dancing across calculators and phones. Behind thick glass, interpreters struggled to turn centuries of pain and power into polite diplomatic phrases. On the towering screen above the podium, the title read like a corporate memo: Debt, Defense, and Development in Africa, charting a path forward. France was hosting, which meant France was directing. They controlled the timing, the microphones, the order of speakers, and more importantly, the narrative. Everything was scripted, from the polite applause to the carefully staged smiles. They were here to reassert their place as Africa's premier European partner, the one who had given the most, lost the most, and, in their view, still deserved the most. And yet, one seat near the back didn't quite fit the script. Ibrahim Traoré, 35 years old, President of Burkina Faso, sat quietly in the second row. Not at the main table, not listed among the speakers, just another name badge in the crowd. It was a subtle insult, dressed as formality, a reminder of where France believed he belonged in the global pecking order. But appearances deceive, and history, as the world was about to learn, doesn't ask for permission when it decides to pivot. Roland Dufert, France's foreign minister, stepped up to the podium. His silver hair perfectly combed, his suit perfectly pressed, his voice trained for power. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, smooth and practiced, "we are not strangers. France has always stood by Africa. That will never change." He paused. Cameras zoomed in, his expression solemn, like a priest delivering a sermon. "We have forgiven Africa's debt more than once," he continued, voice rising theatrically. "We have restructured loans, offered aid, opened our markets, trained your brightest students." Chuckles rippled through the crowd. Encouraged, he pressed on. "We've built your roads, your schools, your hospitals, and still, we are told we have not done enough, that our efforts fall short, that our generosity is not appreciated." His tone now shifted. Less diplomatic, more like a disappointed headmaster. "Perhaps some forget," he said, "who provided the expertise, the infrastructure, the technology that made modern Africa possible." Laughter grew louder now, more confident, echoing off the stone walls like applause for a job well done. "We are generous," he said, arms spread wide. "But let's be honest, Africa still owes us. Not just in debt, but in gratitude, in culture, in development. We gave much. We deserve recognition." This time, the laughter turned thunderous. Cameras captured it all, the nods, the smirks, the satisfaction on the faces of European leaders and investors. And then came the moment. As cameras swept across the African delegation, most of them smiled diplomatically. Some nodded slightly, others stared straight ahead. The usual performance of quiet tolerance. But not Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't blink, didn't speak. He just stared directly at Duffert. No anger, no scorn. Just a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the room. And that silence said everything. It said, "We remember." It said, "We know the price of your generosity." It said, "We are done playing grateful." It said, "You no longer get to define us." For the first time that morning, the room shifted. And no one, not the investors, not the commissioners, not even Duffert, could explain why that stare unsettled them so deeply. Because power, when met with silence, becomes a mirror. And in that mirror they saw themselves, not as benevolent saviors, but as relics of a fading empire trying to demand applause from those who had endured its cost. That moment was never included in the official press release, but everyone who was there remembers it. The day Africa didn't raise its voice because it no longer needed to. To challenge France openly in such a setting could jeopardize future alliances, funding, and national reputations. Most African leaders in the room knew this, and so they smiled, they nodded, they played the script. Except one. In the second row, Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He didn't adjust his tie or whisper to an aide. He didn't look at Duffert, or the diplomats, or even the laughing crowd around him. He looked directly into the main broadcast camera. Still, unblinking, silent. Not at the machine, but through it. As if he were staring straight into the eyes of every person around the world who would one day watch this footage. There was no trace of anger on his face, no sarcasm, no mask of politeness, just calm, just presence. And something more powerful than any speech, total, unshakable authenticity. The cameraman, trained to spot moments that matter, locked in on Troy's expression. Something about the stillness, the refusal to play along, was magnetic. While ministers shuffled papers, adjusted posture, and tried to project authority, Traoré sat motionless, focused, alive. And something shifted. The laughter in the room began to thin, the easy smiles faded. One by one, heads turned toward the second row. A subtle tension radiated from his silence, like static before a storm. He wasn't reacting, he was becoming a reaction. In newsrooms around the world, editors were beginning to notice. The live feed was trending. Screenshots of Troy's silent stare were already circulating across social media. One image in particular captured the moment perfectly. Duffert mid-laugh, the room frozen in applause, while Traoré stared, calm and alone, as if refusing the entire performance. But inside the Grand Palais, the program continued, or tried to. The session was set to end with closing remarks from the French delegation and a networking lunch, the real business of the day. But 16 minutes after Duffert's final words, that plan began to fall apart. In the foyer outside the main chamber, French Foreign Minister Duffert was surrounded by reporters. Microphones pointed at his face, cameras jostled. He welcomed the attention. This was his moment to dominate the headlines. A journalist from Le Monde stepped forward. "Your comments about Africa's debt have caused quite a stir. Can you clarify what you meant by moral and cultural debt?" Duffert smiled, pleased. "What I meant," he said, "is simply recognition. France has given Africa far more than just money. We've shared our institutions, our language, our values. That's not something you can put a price on." A Reuters reporter pushed in, "But critics say France has extracted more from Africa than it's ever given. That it's not partnership, it's exploitation." Duffert's tone sharpened, but his smile remained. "That's a simplistic view. Economic relationships are always mutual. Africa has gained access to markets, technology, jobs. We've built schools, roads, and infrastructure. That's the nature of global commerce. The exchange went on. Familiar, rehearsed, deflective. But elsewhere in the building, something unprecedented was happening. Near the hall entrance, African Union delegates were huddled in conversation. Phones buzzed. Quiet arguments were made. A consensus formed. Swift, serious, and coordinated. Dr. Amina Khan, the African Union's representative, approached the forum's chief moderator, a seasoned Swedish diplomat named Lars Andersson. She handed him a small folded note with the formality of statecraft. The African Union requests that President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso be granted time to address the forum before lunch, she said. Her voice was even, but carried unmistakable weight. Anderson opened the note. His eyes scanned the words. His brow rose slightly. This was not on the schedule. "This is highly irregular," he replied. "The speaking order is locked in, and we're already behind." Dr. Khan didn't argue. She didn't plead. Her tone remained composed but resolute. "President Traoré has observed respectfully for the entirety of this forum. He hasn't sought attention. He hasn't disrupted anything. He only asks to speak, to contribute to a conversation about his continent's future." Anderson looked past her into the main hall. Traoré was still seated, still silent, still watching. Anderson hesitated. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This wasn't political theater. This was something else. "How much time would he need?" the moderator finally asked. "He has requested 10 minutes, Dr. Khan said calmly. "No more than that." The moderator paused, considering the implications. 10 minutes wasn't much, but the symbolism, immense. The African Union's formal request added serious weight, enough that a refusal might be seen not just as rude, but as a diplomatic affront to the entire continent. "Very well," he said. "Inform President Traoré he will have 10 minutes following the coffee break." The news moved quickly. French officials were alerted almost instantly. In the corner of the foyer, senior advisors clustered around Minister Duffer in a quiet but urgent huddle. "Don't let him speak," urged Marie-Claire Dubois, the Deputy Director for African Affairs. "This could completely derail the tone of the forum." "We can't block him without looking authoritarian," said Pierre Marot, Duffer's chief of staff. "But we can manage the optics. Make sure he understands the limits." Duffert glanced toward the main hall, his confidence fraying at the edges. "What do we know about this Traoré?" Dubois checked her tablet. "He's young, came to power via a coup in 2022. Hasn't made much international noise, mostly focused on internal reforms. His English is good, but he's not exactly known for charisma." Duffert allowed himself a smile. "Then perhaps we're overreacting. Let him speak. What harm can one quiet little president do in 10 minutes?" That question would soon echo across headlines and history books alike. As the coffee break ended and delegates returned to the hall, a shift was already underway. The air had changed, less rehearsed, more alert. Journalists whispered to one another and repositioned their cameras. Something unscheduled was about to happen. At the podium, the moderator cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, before our scheduled closing remarks, we have a brief address from President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." A ripple passed through the crowd. Traoré rose slowly. No nod, no wave, no performance. Just a steady, deliberate walk toward the stage, his presence somehow louder than any applause could have been. At the podium, he reached into his jacket and unfolded a small cloth, red, green, and gold, the colors of his flag. He laid it gently on the lectern. No flourish, just recognition. Then he looked out across the hall, not scanning the room but meeting it, face by face, delegate by delegate, journalist by journalist. Silence fell. Not the ceremonial quiet that precedes a speech, but something deeper, a hush born of tension, curiosity, uncertainty. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Still, Troy said nothing. People shifted. Some glanced toward the sound team, unsure if something had malfunctioned. But the microphones were working, the cameras were rolling, and Troy was simply waiting, or rather, studying. It felt as though he were taking stock, not of the hall, but of the people in it, of what they expected, of how comfortable they'd become with the old script. And then he spoke. His voice was clear, measured, without strain but filled with weight. "France says Africa owes her," he began. "That's interesting." A pause, short, sharp. "We paid in ivory, in uranium, in gold, in diamonds, in cobalt, in coffee, in cotton, in cocoa. We paid with the labor of our grandparents, with the knowledge of our ancestors, with the resources beneath our soil." His tone was even, almost clinical, like a ledger being read aloud. Facts, debts, transactions. "We paid in forgotten languages, in broken traditions, in interrupted stories. We paid in the lives of those who resisted, in the silence of those who complied, in the dreams that were never allowed to grow." The room was frozen now. No one looked at their phones. No one whispered. Even the translators slowed, their voices cracking under the weight of what they were translating. "We paid in the division of our communities, in the redrawing of maps, in the imposition of systems designed not for our benefit, but for someone else's gain." He paused, his gaze now fixed squarely on the French delegation. Still no anger, no theatrics, just precision. "We paid in instability, in dependency, in the exhausting, endless effort to prove our worth to those who never questioned their own. We paid with our silence, for decades." He looked down, then back up. His voice softened, just slightly. "But today we owe ourselves something different. We owe ourselves the truth, the recognition of our resilience, the acknowledgement of our leadership. We owe ourselves the right to define our partnerships, on our terms. We owe ourselves the courage to speak without bitterness, and the clarity to walk away from arrangements that no longer serve us." The translator stumbled slightly on the word future. Cameras captured it. The whole world was now watching. "We owe ourselves the strength to say no, to pity, disguised as partnership, and yes, to dignity rooted in equality." Camera flashes erupted across the room, bursts of light against stone walls. The moment was already being clipped, streamed, posted, shared. But inside the hall, no one moved. Because what had just happened wasn't just a speech, it was a reckoning. And everyone knew it. Outside the hall, the world was exploding, with clips, quotes, hot takes. But inside, the people in that room were still trying to process what they were hearing. "France wants applause for the roads," Troy continued, his tone easing into something almost conversational, as though speaking not to politicians, but to people. "But what were those roads built for?" He let the question hang. "To connect our communities to one another, or to connect our minerals to your ports, to move our people, or to speed up the extraction of what lay beneath their feet." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it cut through decades of polite diplomacy like a scalpel. "Infrastructure isn't neutral," he said. "It tells a story about who it's meant to serve and who it leaves behind." Then came the turn. "You say Africa still owes you. We say thank you for the roads. But we built the soul that walks them. We built the dreams that travel them, the determination that refuses to be defined by them." The metaphor landed like a wave. What was once seen as a symbol of generosity now became something else, a platform Africans had made their own. We built the languages that flow over them, French, yes, but also Moray, Dula, and dozens more. Languages that don't belong to Europe or Africa, but to the space between, the space of creation, the space of possibility, the space of real partnership. People in the audience were sitting up straighter now. This was no longer just a speech, it was a redefinition. We built the businesses that depend on them, the innovations that travel them, the schools that teach our children not to see them as gifts from benefactors, but as tools for building their future, our way. Troy was doing something rare in global diplomacy. He wasn't rejecting the past, but reclaiming it, reframing it. We built the music that moves through them, the art that decorates them, the stories that give them meaning beyond logistics or GDP. His voice dropped slightly. We built the love that makes them sacred, the memory that makes them ours, the hope that makes them more than just paths to ports. They're pathways to a future we define. And then, he reached into his jacket. The room tensed. From his inner pocket, he pulled out a small USB stick, simple, unremarkable, ordinary. But the moment he held it up, it became the most powerful object in the room. This, Troy said, holding the device where every camera could see it, contains Burkina Faso's satellite defense plans. Gasps, audible. Our engineers developed this technology ourselves, using our resources, our minds, and our vision. No euros from Europe, no dollars from America, no yuan from China. A rustle swept through the room. Phones lit up. Advisors leaned in. The French delegation looked stunned. We did this, he said, with African determination, African expertise, African innovation. He placed the USB beside the folded flag on the podium. You can download it. It's public. The silence was now electric. We're not hiding anymore. We're not apologizing for our intelligence. We're not waiting for permission to be brilliant. This wasn't just about technology. It was a challenge to the very architecture of global power. If Burkina Faso can do this, what else can Africa do? And what does that mean for a world built on the assumption that we must always be helped, never leading? He wasn't finished. We're sharing this, Troy said, because we believe in collaboration, not extraction, in partnership, not dependency. The French delegation was unraveling, phones buzzing, aides whispering, senior staff in a low-grade panic. Duffert was being handed notes as fast as they could write them. We're sharing this, Troy continued, because true security doesn't come from hoarding power. It comes from building systems that serve everyone. He looked out over the crowd. Because we know the challenges facing Africa cannot be solved by someone else's blueprint. They require African solutions, African wisdom, African will. And then, he said the part that couldn't be unsaid. We share it, he said slowly, because we refuse to be defined by what we lack and demand to be seen for what we contribute. There it was. We're not recipients. We're not spectators. We're not shadows of your legacy. His gaze swept to the French delegation. We are authors of our future. In the control booth, panic had turned to action. Cut the feed, Duffert whispered to his chief of staff. Now! This is getting out of hand. But it was already too late. The forum was being broadcast live across multiple channels. Social media had seized the moment, and any attempt to shut it down would only fuel the fire. Journalists were already breaking news alerts. African leaders in capitals across the continent were watching, some stunned, others smiling. In European foreign ministries, emergency meetings were being called. What had begun as a polite diplomatic forum had just become something else entirely. A declaration, a reckoning, a turning point. As governments scrambled to respond to the shockwaves of President Troy's revelations, something even more unexpected was quietly brewing in the cafes and classrooms of Paris. It wasn't diplomats or journalists driving the next wave of change. It was students, young people across France, Many watching the live stream out of curiosity found themselves riveted, not by controversy, not by scandal, but by dignity, by truth. A tweet from a 22-year-old Sorbonne student captured the moment. "For the first time in my life, I'm proud of Africa more than my own government." Within minutes, it went viral. This wasn't the reaction anyone had predicted. The expectation was that French youth would rally behind the nation's historic role in African affairs, parroting old lines about aid, cooperation, and responsibility. But something shifted. Social media began to fill with praise for Troy's honesty, criticism of France's colonial hangover, and calls for a more balanced, equitable future between Europe and Africa. The hashtag #True Partnership began trending across Europe. Suddenly, Troy's message wasn't just an African rallying cry, it was a mirror held up to the global north. But inside the hall, the man himself wasn't done. Troy stepped back to the microphone. His voice, steady and composed, now carried a quiet urgency. "We owe ourselves honesty about what partnership actually means," he said. "Not speeches, not ceremonies, not charity." A pause. Partnership means equal voice. It means equal benefit. It means equal respect for sovereignty, for dignity, for the right to define our own future. No one moved. This is not just about France. This is about an entire system, built after colonialism, designed to look different but act the same. A system that rewards dependency, that protects old advantages with new language. He looked around the room, no longer speaking only to delegates, but to history itself. "We owe ourselves the courage to say some partnerships are not partnerships at all. They are engineered dependencies, carefully maintained, endlessly justified." The silence was now deeper than before, not confusion, realization. "We owe ourselves the vision to imagine a world where cooperation is rooted in mutual benefit, not inherited hierarchy. We owe ourselves the creativity to build that world." By now, the live stream audience had ballooned. News networks were cutting into regular programming. Social media was flooded with quotes, clips, and commentary. Governments were drafting memos. Embassies were scrambling. And Troy was still speaking, calm, composed, relentless. "We owe ourselves the patience to build these relationships gradually, but also the clarity to say what we will no longer accept." This was the brilliance of his delivery, a revolutionary message dressed in diplomatic restraint. "We owe ourselves the unity to stand together when our sovereignty is tested, to share knowledge, defend innovation, and protect our right to self-determination." Delegates looked toward the African Union delegation, already in quiet motion, already thinking, already planning. Troy's voice dropped slightly. "We owe ourselves the confidence to engage the world not as students, but as equals, as contributors, as authors of the next chapter in global leadership." And then, it was over. Troy stepped back from the microphone. He folded his flag, left the USB on the podium, still glowing under the lights. A challenge, a symbol, a promise. "Thank you," he said. And with that, he walked back to his seat. In the second row, he sat, hands folded, eyes forward, while the room behind him unraveled. Some delegates clapped, others stared. Journalists typed furiously, cameras snapped, social media exploded, but Troy said nothing more. He didn't stay for the networking lunch. He didn't give interviews. He didn't mingle with diplomats or pose for photos. Instead, he exited quietly through the Grand Palais lobby, declined all comment, and stepped into the same modest embassy van that had brought him to the forum that morning. His departure, like his arrival, was quiet. But the impact? Anything but. That night, the African Union convened an emergency session. Analysts were already breaking down the technology Troy had shared. Across the continent, from Lagos to Addis Ababa, Troy's speech was being studied not as performance, but as blueprint. By midnight, the AU had reached a unanimous decision. President Ibrahim Traoré would lead a new continental defense and innovation initiative, a role that would make him one of the most powerful and influential figures in Africa. The next morning, global headlines told the story. Burkina Faso president shocks Europe with tech reveal. African unity surges after Traoré speech. New African leader redefines global partnerships. But one headline stood out. From the Financial Times, Turkey, Brazil, and South Africa signed defense accord with Burkina Faso. While French diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout, other nations had already moved, eager to form alliances beyond the traditional Western sphere. And then came the dagger. France excluded from new African Defense Council talks. Within 48 hours of the forum's conclusion, the African Union announced the formation of a new continental body focused on defense and tech collaboration. And France, despite decades of military ties, was not invited. History had turned, and the man who sat in silence during laughter, who spoke without raising his voice, who walked away without a handshake, had just redrawn the map of international power. France had never seen anything like it. For decades, it had been the unquestioned military partner of choice across Africa, training officers, supplying arms, shaping strategy. The idea that African nations might coordinate defense planning without French oversight wasn't just unusual. It was heresy, a direct challenge to the colonial-era security architecture that had survived long after colonialism had supposedly ended. And France's response? Swift and deeply revealing. Instead of engaging with the truths Traoré had laid bare, instead of addressing the deep and valid questions about sovereignty, dignity, and equality, French officials chose deflection. They called his actions inappropriate. They accused him of breaking protocol. Foreign Minister Dufour told reporters Traoré's decision to share defense technology publicly was reckless, a violation of regional security norms. But the world saw it for what it was, a deflection. Proof of exactly what Traoré had exposed. France wasn't interested in partnership. It was interested in control. And while Paris was scrambling to regain its footing, the rest of the world was reacting. The United States, officially neutral, quietly welcomed the idea of reduced French influence on the continent. China saw a moment of opportunity, an opening to build new partnerships based on the respectful tone Traoré had set. Russia, always eager to chip away at Western dominance, openly offered to share its own defense technology with any African state ready to break from the old order. But the most unexpected and arguably most powerful reaction came not from diplomats or presidents. It came from the streets of Paris, from the cafes and lecture halls, from the children of the colonial legacy, from the French people themselves. The Sorbonne student's viral tweet, "For the first time in my life I'm proud of Africa more than my own government," was just the beginning. Soon, protests swept university campuses across France. Panels were held, debates erupted, placards filled the streets. We owe ourselves now. Partnership, not patronage. Africa rising, France listening. These were not African immigrants demanding justice. These were young French citizens, the grandchildren of empire, demanding a new moral framework for their country's global role. At the Élysée Palace, President Macron sat in the dark, watching a replay of Traoré's speech on a tablet. The words were muted, but the images spoke volumes. That steady gaze, that quiet voice, that refusal to flinch. Macron turned to his chief of staff. "He didn't shout," he murmured. "He didn't insult us. He just looked at us and made us look at ourselves." And that, more than any quote or accusation, was the revolution. Traoré hadn't won with noise. He had won with dignity. "Should we reach out?" the aide asked. "Try to rebuild the relationship? Bring them back into the fold?" Macron didn't answer. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the street below. On the embassy steps, young protesters were singing, holding signs, chanting not in anger, but in resolve, signs that said, "Africa deserves respect. We are not our ancestors' empire. History does not repeat. We rewrite it." Macron saw what Traoré already knew. This wasn't a diplomatic crisis, it was a moral reckoning, a realignment not just of African politics, but of French identity. The protests only grew. University students organized teach-ins about colonial history. Activists launched campaigns to divest from corporations exploiting African resources. Influencers turned their platforms into classrooms, educating millions on France's role in Africa, past and present. The government tried to respond. They announced new aid packages. They promised reforms. They offered more consultation. But it all rang hollow. Because Traoré hadn't challenged France's policies, he had challenged France's assumptions. The idea that France had the right to define what was good for Africa. The belief that France deserved leadership on the continent. The unspoken notion that power should never be equal, only managed. 6 months later, the world looked different. Across Africa, something new was taking shape. For the first time in modern history, African nations were coordinating in real time, aligning defense policy, tech strategy, and development goals. The Continental Defense Innovation Initiative, once an idea, had become a reality. With research hubs in 12 African nations, partnerships with tech firms in Asia and Latin America, and advisory councils built by African scientists, not Western consultants. The satellite defense system Traoré had unveiled in Paris, it had since been upgraded, improved, and integrated into a network built by Africans, for Africans. More than hardware, it had become a symbol of what was possible when Africa defined its own interests. And the psychological shift? Even greater than the political one. Across the continent, a new generation had watched a leader confront centuries of condescension and win. Students now studied Traoré's speech in international relations classes. Activists quoted it in their manifestos. Politicians used its language in negotiations with the IMF and World Bank. Because it wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point. They had seen that dignity could speak louder than dominance, that silence could break centuries of noise, and that one leader, armed with vision, authenticity, and the refusal to bow, could shift the gravitational center of the world. And he hadn't raised his voice. He had simply refused to look away. Traoré's speech didn't just echo across parliaments. It reshaped the soul of a continent. It became a masterclass in how to confront power without forfeiting dignity, how to demand transformation without discarding the hope of collaboration. And as his words continued to ripple outward, Africa was already changing. In tech hubs, from Lagos to Kigali, a new wave of innovation was accelerating. Young engineers, inspired by their peers in Burkina Faso, no longer doubted their place on the world stage. Governments began to grasp a fundamental truth. Political independence was fragile without technological independence. Investment in research and education surged. But the transformation wasn't just political or technological, it was cultural. African languages were spoken unapologetically in global forums. Leaders stopped code switching for credibility. They followed Traoré's lead, speaking not to please, but to be heard. African diplomats, artists, and thinkers began showing the world something it hadn't expected, that authenticity could be more persuasive than assimilation. Music celebrated African triumphs, not just African traumas. Films told stories of inventors and builders, not just survivors. Novels explored dignity and equality, not just struggle and injustice. But the deepest shift wasn't on the global stage. It was internal. Africans were beginning to see themselves differently. Students who once believed the best education lived abroad now enrolled in African universities producing world-class research. Young minds who once thought innovation was an export from the West now built biotech labs, launched satellites, and programmed AI on African soil. And Europe? It began to change too. A new generation of European leaders began to see what their predecessors hadn't, that domination wasn't just immoral, it was unsustainable. They started to listen. Global institutions felt the pressure. The World Bank restructured its Africa programs to prioritize African leadership. The IMF brought African economists into decision-making roles. The UN faced rising calls to give Africa a real seat at the table, not just in name, but in influence. Trade deals were rewritten. No more exporting raw materials just to import the finished product. No more one-sided terms. African nations demanded fair pricing, local processing, and investment in their own logistics networks. Even climate negotiations began to reflect this new world. African leaders stood at the center, not the margins, insisting that sustainability didn't mean sacrificing progress. And education? The old pipelines reversed. Europe no longer just hosted African students. European students now traveled to Africa to study tech, public health, sustainability, and learn from a continent that had become a laboratory of innovation. Resistance, of course, remained. Some governments clung to the past with veiled threats and quiet sabotage. Some corporations used market leverage to slow the momentum. Some media outlets painted the transformation as chaos rather than evolution. But the tide had turned. Because the generation that witnessed Troy's speech had learned something irreversible. Dignity is not negotiable. Partnership is not charity. Respect is not optional. And no matter the price of change, they refused to go back to systems that had never truly served them. The anniversary of Troy's speech soon became more than a date. It became a global symbol, a holiday marked not by parades, but by conversations, by lectures, by cultural events across cities in Africa, Europe, and beyond. The USB drive Troy left behind, small, silent, and revolutionary, was placed in the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. But it wasn't just a relic. It was proof that shared knowledge could build a future beyond borders. Universities from every continent began collaborating with African institutions. Entrepreneurs from Brazil to South Korea sought out African partners. Engineers and artists flocked to a continent that had once been dismissed and was now leading. And beyond Africa, the ripple effect continued. Nations long dominated by colonial powers took inspiration. They began demanding fair trade, true cooperation, and the same kind of self-respect that Troy had modeled. The world itself was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, toward real multilateralism. And it all began with a stare. Not a scream, not a slogan, not a war. Just a man who refused to laugh along with the joke, who refused to perform, who looked into a camera, into history, and into the eyes of future generations, and chose silence over submission. That single act cracked something open. France's minister had smirked and said, "Africa still owes us." The room had laughed, but one man hadn't. He had looked back, and that look rewrote history. Because justice doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in quietly, places a USB drive on a podium, and dares the world to imagine a different future. A future where cooperation is not control. Where equality is not granted, it's claimed. Where revolutions aren't always loud, but always true. And that future? It wasn't coming anymore. It had already begun.